Hi, Rick. Welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning. How are you, John?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I'm great.
Okay. And where are you right now?
We live in southern Kentucky in the United States, just about 4 or 5 miles from the Tennessee border. So we're kind of right on the border of the South. This is kind of a interesting area. It's a mixture of country people and city people who have moved here after retirement, and so it's a beautiful part of the country.
I've been down there on a motorcycle. I used to tour back in the 80s, and I drove through there. Maybe I even went through your town.
Possible.
So you wrote a book, which is very interesting. But what's more interesting is you walked across the United States.
Yes, we did. From
Tell us
Santa
about
Monica Pier. Yeah, from
that.
Santa
Okay.
Monica Pier
Hmm.
in Los Angeles to the Supreme Court steps in Washington, D.C. About 2,770 miles. We walked 20 miles a day, 6 days a week for 6 months.
That's quite the feat. And when did you do that?
We did it in 2006, so 17 years ago. It's actually taken that long for me to get the book to the place where I felt like it was ready to share with people. We would tell stories about the walk everywhere we would go because really the book is just a collection of stories. And everybody would say, you need to write a book. So I started that process back in 2007, right after the walk. But I couldn't write. As a matter of fact, I went back to graduate school when I was about 52, 53 years old after the walk. And my first paper I turned in, the professor turned it back and it looked like a can of red paint had exploded all over it. And he said, you can't write. And he said, if you don't learn to write, you'll never get through this master's program. But
Wow.
he said, if you'll let me teach you, I'll teach you to write. And he was an author himself. So that's kind of where my writing journey started. And then after that, I did my doctorate. And so I had to write a dissertation. So I refined my writing skills. So I kept pulling the book in and out. And finally, we got to the place where we said, we want this story to be preserved after we're gone. And the best way to do that is to publish it as a book. And that way it'll be there. If anybody wants to read it, great. If they don't, that's okay too. But at least the story won't get lost. So it took a long time, but it's finally out.
Okay. Well, that sounds very good. And I'm curious, how long is the book?
It's I'm just finished with the audiobook. So it'll be out soon. And I think it took me about 10 hours to read through it. It won't be nearly that long if somebody's reading to themselves, but it's 250 pages or so.
Hmm. Substantial. That's good.
Yeah, about
So there was
75,000 words.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a novel right there.
yeah.
So it's a collection of journals that you wrote along the way that you then comprised into a book. Is that how it works?
Yeah, my wife kept two journals. She is an avid journal keeper, and so she's very good at it. So the first journal was just a logistical journal. We walked from this mile marker to this mile marker. These were the landmarks. She documented every day's walk because we knew when we got done there'd be some folks who'd said, "You didn't really do that." So we wanted to have some actual proof, and we could back up the story if that ever came into question. The other journal was a journal of every person we met along the way and every experience we had with them. We actually talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. We routed ourselves through the inner cities on purpose. And so we had lots of encounters with lots of people. Even out in the middle of the desert, it was kind of amazing. We had
Mm.
encounters with people. So those stories were written down by my wife. And then I took that collection of stories and kind of molded it into this nonfiction book. It reads really like a fiction book. It reads like a novel. And I say in the preface that it's going to seem unbelievable when you read these stories because it was really quite an amazing thing. I think it was the greatest experience of our life. I think I can say that without any reservation.
Absolutely. Now you did this with a purpose in mind.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk freely and openly about that. I think it's a beautiful purpose. Tell us all about
Yeah.
that.
Um, well, for us, the purpose was we really felt like we've been in the ministry all of our lives. So we really felt like our country, and particularly the church, had gotten way off track. And I'm not a critic of the church necessarily. I'm not anti-church, but I've often said that if Jesus or the apostles were to show up in our current time, they wouldn't recognize what we call church as church. Maybe the best way, I pulled up a quote here to explain it is, I said, God was burdening my heart for our entire country from top to bottom, from left to right. We needed healing from angry words and loveless religion. We needed something more than empty words about heaven and hell. We needed a revival of Jesusism, plain and simple. So to me, that's what the walk was about. And so we wanted to meet as many different kinds of people as we could, and allow God to change our hearts and our vision, and melt away our prejudices. And, sometimes you don't even realize those things are there. I'm a child of the 60s. And so most of us who were raised in that era kind of pride ourselves in not being people of prejudice and being open to different ethnicities and races and religions and all those kinds of things. But even when you don't realize those things are there, many times when you find yourself in circumstances like we did, you realize there is something there that doesn't feel right, doesn't look right, isn't consistent with what you say you believe. Mm-hmm. And so the purpose for us was to try to impress on the people that we met that this is what it really should look like. What we found was that although we thought the biggest impression was going to be on other people, the biggest transformation actually changed us and happened in our hearts. It was really quite transformational.
Wonderful. That's what it's all about. That's what I remember it to be all about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's great. So let me ask you some practical questions, like what was your feet like? What kind of shoes did you wear? Did you get sore? Did you get blisters? How did that work out?
Yeah, we actually trained for a year. We were not athletes in any stretch of the imagination. I was the kind of guy who went to the shopping center and drove from one store to the other. So we were not walkers. So we trained for a year. We went to lots of shoe stores. We went to lots of places who could analyze our feet and kind of steer us in the right direction for long distance walking. We bought expensive shoes in 2006. Our shoes were over $100 a pair, which was a lot of money back then. And so we bought 10 pair of shoes each, and we wore them all out. We also bought a pair of trail shoes, which were heavier duty for when we were walking in mud or out in rain. They had some Gore-Tex in them, so they were supposed to be waterproof. It turned out they weren't waterproof at all. Anyway, that was what we did in preparation. We walked 1,500 miles the year before the walk. Logistically, we walked about 20 miles a day. And the way we did that, we had volunteer drivers who came every week of the walk. We had a support vehicle. And on Monday morning, the mathematically, the way it worked out in theory never was like that exactly, but we would drive backwards 60 miles, walk 20. They'd pick us up and bring us back to camp. And the next day they would take us out 40. We'd walk 20, and they'd pick us up, bring us back to camp. And then after Wednesday, we would go the other direction. Then on Saturday, when we were done walking, we'd move 120 miles down the road because that's what we walked in a week. We had a little wooden stake with a blue flag on it that we drove into the ground every day when we were done walking. So we knew where to start the next day. And of course, we had Jane's journals too, to say it was by the McDonald's or by this big cacti or whatever it happened to be out in the desert. But that's how the logistics worked. The van carried water and food and extra medical supplies and change of clothes and all that sort of thing in case we needed it. I had blisters for the first 2 weeks, and it was interesting because the year before, when we were walking 5 to 10 miles a day, we never got blisters. When we actually started the walk, I got blisters almost immediately because the second day it rained all day and my feet were wet all day when I walked, and so I got blisters. And someone said, what you need to do is smear Vaseline all over your feet before you put your socks on, and then there'll be no friction. Well, that worked for me. Did not work for Jane at all. She had blisters which covered her feet from week 1 to week 26. It was horribly painful for her. She lost a big toe. big toenail. And so it was a pretty painful trip for her. There were days when I didn't know how she was going to put shoes and socks on and walk 20 miles, but she's a very determined person. And I can tell you, I would not have finished the walk if it were not for her. Yeah. I sustained a very painful and serious accident in Russellville, Arkansas. It was the 21st of April. We were over halfway, and I spilled a almost boiling cup of coffee on myself, and I had second and third degree burns. We went to the emergency room. I had to go to the burn center in Little Rock. They said, you won't walk for 2 weeks, and that was going to be a problem. We had a deadline. We needed to be in Washington by July 4th. We had a permit for a rally on the Supreme Court steps, and so we knew we didn't have a lot of leeway there. But 2 days after the accident, I walked 5 miles. I didn't walk 20, but I did walk 5. And so we had lots of physical things. I fell and hurt my back and dislocated a finger and just minor stuff like that. But the biggest threat was dogs. We had lots of bad experiences with dogs. We carried tear gas and never had to use it, but we thought we were going to have to a few times. But there were challenges and issues. Obvious, if you're walking about 2/3 of a marathon every day, 6 days a week. So your body never recovers. It just never has time to recuperate. And that's the biggest issue.
Right. And remind the audience, how long did it take you to do this trip?
6 months. We left on January 1st. And we got to Washington, D.C. Actually, we got to the outskirts of Washington, D.C. on June 30th. We had 3 days to rest. And about 30 of our friends came to Washington, D.C. and walked across the bridge from Virginia into Washington with us. So it took 6 months, almost to the day. And it was a grueling 6 months in some ways. We walked in every kind of weather. We had agreed we'd walk in any weather except lightning, because many places we were the tallest lightning rod around when we were walking. So we didn't want to do that. We did walk close enough to a funnel cloud to see it one day in Oklahoma. Walked in lots of rain and a little bit of snow, not much.
So when you were walking through the inner cities, as you said, and even out in the desert, you mentioned, you came across people, you spoke with them, and tell us a few experiences you had with some of the more interesting folks that you talked with.
Yeah, I always like to tell the story. We walked through 5 Native American reservations. We did that on purpose. We had spent quite a bit of time with the Navajos before the walk across America, and so we had kind of an affinity with them and an attachment to them emotionally. And so we wanted to make sure that we walked through as many Native American reservations as possible. One day we were walking through Winslow, Arizona, standing on the corner, and we were leaving town, and we saw a man standing at the Welcome to Winslow sign, which has 2 big beams in the middle. We didn't know what they were, but we thought, well, let's take this last opportunity to strike up a conversation. So turns out this Navajo man's name was Rick. And when he turned around to talk to us, he was crying. And so we asked him what was wrong, and he said, I was just remembering. Well, it turns out those 2 steel beams are from the World Trade Centers. And he was sent with the Navajo Job Corps to Washington, D.C. to sift through the rubble and look for bodies. And he said, I was just remembering what it was like to find a body. And so we had a long conversation with Rick, and he was homeless, living under the bridge right near the interstate. And I asked Rick if he needed anything, if we could do anything. We bought McDonald's gift cards and kept them so that we could give homeless folks meal cards so they could get something to eat, and lots of different ways to help folks. And I asked him if there was anything he needed. He said, I'm awfully hungry. Well, I know how to take care of hunger. So I knew there was a Flying J right across the street, and they had a huge buffet. So I said, let's go across the street, and I'll buy you the buffet, and you can eat till you don't want to eat anymore. And he said on the way over, he said, they won't let me eat inside because I'm homeless and because I'm an Indian. That was his words. And I said, well, let's go see. And so we walked in, and I told the cashier, I said, I'd like to buy my friend Rick the buffet for lunch. And while I was reaching for my wallet, she was reaching under the counter for a to-go container. And when she pulled it out, I say in the book, I'm not sure I ever knew what righteous indignation was until that moment. When she pulled out that to-go container, I said, "No, ma'am, he's going to want to sit down and eat just like everybody else." And so I bought him the buffet, and I stayed long enough to make sure that they had allowed him to sit and get his food, and he was eating. Now, that's interesting to me for lots of reasons, but the thing that makes that story especially uh, pertinent for the way I feel and what I think I'm trying to accomplish in my life. When we got done with the walk, we were giving a talk one day in a church about the walk and some of the things, and I told the story of Rick. It just so happened that was the Sunday they were taking communion at the church. One of the elders prayed before communion, and she said, "God, I thank you that at your table there are no to-go containers, that everyone is welcome to sit at your table." And I think that encapsulates so much of who I am, so much of what I believe, so much of what I think Jesus was about, so much of what the walk was about, is that everyone is welcome at his table. And I think I say in the book that if everyone is not welcome at your table, then you're probably sitting at the wrong table. And I think a lot of people, in the name of religion, in the name of church, in the name of God, we heard stories, just horrible stories about things that were done to the Native Americans in the name of God, carried off to places for 4 or 5 years and kind of re-educated, weren't allowed to speak their native language, baptized into a church that, they wanted them to be baptized in. That kind of stuff is just, it's so, it's just antithetical to the message, I think, of Jesus and of what the church ought to be. And so I think this idea that everyone's welcome at the table is just really, really important to me. And I hope that one of the things that we accomplished in the walk was, as I said, we talked to hundreds of people, if not thousands. I hope that at each one of those encounters, we left the impression that you are special, you deserve dignity, no matter who you are, what color you are, whatever you are precious, and you are good. And so that's one story that really just speaks to me.
Yeah. That's a beautiful story. Beautiful. And the message is wonderful. Yeah. The two of you sound like really good people. Did you ever experience any ridicule from people who perhaps don't take kindly to your message?
Well, I know this won't surprise you, John, but the best response, my favorite place to walk through was West Memphis, Arkansas. Totally African American community. We were well received there. People kept passing by in their cars, and they'd roll down their window a crack and say, white people, and they would say, "You shouldn't be in this neighborhood. This isn't safe." We never felt threatened by anyone. And so we never felt people were a threat to us. But the most unkind and the rudest responses we got were at churches. We would stop at churches as we entered town. We'd see a church, we'd knock on the door. If someone was there, many times the pastor would come to the door. We would say, "Hey, this is what we're doing. We don't want money. We don't want anything from you. We just wanted to stop and say hi. This is what we're doing," and ask if there was anything we could pray with you or your church about, if you're facing anything that we could help with. And the rudest responses we got were from the people who answered doors at churches. And we've been warned about that by another friend who had done a similar country walk. And I didn't believe him when he told me. But I just found that so sad that here are two people that aren't asking for anything. They're just here to help and here to spread the good word. And you would be opposed to that. You wouldn't want anything to do with that. You wouldn't, offer them a cold cup of water. I don't know. I'm so disappointed sometimes in who we've become, and how far we have fallen away from truth. And I think that's, we talked to dozens of people, and here's what they said, and I'm sure I'm sure you can relate to this. They said, we would talk to people openly about Jesus, and they'd say, "Hey, we don't have a problem with Jesus, but we got a big problem with his people." And I find that such a horrible commentary on who we've become. That's not on the world. That's on us.
Mm-hmm.
We've been unkind. We've been prejudiced. We've been judgmental. We've been all those things that we shouldn't be. Um, and that has caused the world to turn their back on religion, on Christianity in particular, on the church. And so, one of my messages as we go from church to church and speak is that this is the problem. You wonder why people don't want to come. You wonder why people don't want to be a part. You wonder they go into the bar downtown and it's like Cheers. You walk in the door and everybody's Norm. Everybody pats you on the back. They're your best friend. They buy you a drink, and things are great. You walk into church and people are gossiping about you, talking behind your back, stabbing you in the back. So I think we have a long way to come in the church, and I think those of us who claim to follow Jesus need to re-examine his footsteps and make sure that ours are matching up to that. And I find daily in my life that they don't, but my desire is that they will, and that they would. And that's what my life is about. It always has been. At 67 years old, my dad was a pastor for 55 years. I have over 100 years of heritage between my dad and I. Mm-hmm. He came out of the coal mining town of Harlan, Kentucky, in eastern Kentucky, and wasn't raised a Christian. He was raised in a home where God was never mentioned. But because of that, he was a different kind of preacher and a different kind of Christian. He wasn't the judgmental, harsh kind of person you don't want to be like. He was the kindest, gentlest, most helping person that I ever knew in my life. A great mentor and a great example. And I owe him a lot. I stand on his shoulders every day because he taught me to be that way.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So you told me in an email that you started around the time with the Jesus people, the whole Jesus movement,
Yes.
as it was.
Yes.
And I'm very familiar with that. Tell me about how you came to the point where you committed your life to Christ.
Well, for me, I was raised in this church setting. It was a very traditional, of course, most churches were back then, very traditional setting. And even though my dad was what I would say was on the cutting edge for his time, he was still very traditional, and short hair, suit and tie every Sunday, that sort of thing. And I felt like I wanted to be a preacher. I felt like I had a purpose. I felt like there was something that I was called to do, but I knew I couldn't be that kind of preacher. I knew I couldn't be a short-haired, shirt and tie guy. It just wasn't who I was. And one day, a man came to our town and preached, who was part of the Jesus movement. His name was Richard Hogue, great evangelist. He was very, very contemporary, very cutting edge, contemporary Christian music at his crusades. He had long hair, and he wore a buckskin coat with fringe. And I went, and the first night I saw him and I heard him, I said, I can't be the kind of preacher my dad is, but I can be that kind of preacher. If I can be a preacher and look like that, I'll do it. And so that was kind of the beginning for me. I got in kind of on the tail end of the Jesus movement, but it was a very influential thing in my life. And I teach church history actually at University of the Cumberlands, close to us here, and we spend about 2 weeks at the end of the class just talking about the Jesus movement. And of course, there were lots of things about the Jesus movement that were good and right. It broke a lot of ground that needed to be broken. But the Jesus movement involved people. And anytime you involve people, it becomes imperfect. I don't know if you've seen the movie Jesus Revolution, but it's a perfect example of that. With so many good and positive things that came out of that, still because people were involved, egos get involved, and all those kinds of things. And so there are problems. And my wife has reminded me every time I go to a new church over the course of my life. I'm an eternal optimist. I always think things are going to be perfect at the next place, And my wife just continually reminds me, there are people in that church, and because there are people in that church, it's not going to be perfect. There are, my wife's favorite expression is people are messy.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime you're dealing with human beings, it's messy. And the Jesus movement was messy. There was a lot of interaction with drugs and the hippie movement and all those kinds of things that kind of flowed into that movement that made it imperfect. But it was a great time. It was a great time. I think there was a chance there for the church to morph into something very close to first century Christianity, but I think the traditional church squelched that and put a stop to it. Locally where I was, young people were coming in sandals and jeans, unheard of. And the church just clamped down and said, no, if you come here, you gotta dress this way, behave this way, cut your hair, all those kinds of things. And I think that put an end to something that could have made a huge impact on the church in America and worldwide.
So how do you reconcile this idea that amongst Christians they're judging each other who's the real Christian? That doesn't sound right.
No, it doesn't. And I think I think what it signals is a huge departure from who Jesus was and who Jesus taught, what Jesus taught. I'm kind of one of those red letter Christians. If it's in red letters, I'm there. If it's not, then I'm going to weigh it against what the red letters say. And if it doesn't match up, then I'll take the red letters. So I think that's what's happened in the church. And as I said, the church is imperfect. Christians are imperfect. We all have issues. But I think this movement toward nationalism is very dangerous. I think this idea that we want everybody to be like us is very dangerous. You just don't see that in the ministry of Jesus. He doesn't try to get people to conform. He doesn't try to push people into a mold. He does have some moral absolutes that he deals with and that he talks with, because he knows there are certain behaviors and ways that we can act that will make us the best that we can be. But he does that without judgment, and he does that without trying to say, you have to be this way. Jesus' biggest problem was with the religious people. He didn't have problems with the prostitutes. He didn't have problems with the tax collectors, with the public, with all the people that the religious people had problems with. Jesus didn't have problems with them. Jesus had a problem with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He had problems with the people who were very much like many religious people are today. I'm not going to just say Christians, because there are lots of religious people of other religions that are very similar to Pharisees and Sadducees. So I don't want to be too
and let's
too
not forget
particular.
that Pharisees and Sadducees were a political movement.
That's right. That's
and of
right.
course, with religion and politics, so that doesn't mix well.
Yeah, and I think Jesus kind of outlined our path on that when he said, "Render unto Caesar what's Caesar, and unto God what's God's." And I think when he said that, what he was doing was he was saying it's dangerous for those two things to become one thing. It's dangerous for the politics and what you owe Caesar to mix in too much with what you owe God, and vice versa. Because when you get that kind of religion, it gets dangerous. When you study church history, you see how that affected Europe. When the church and the state are one, it becomes even more corrupt, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you get a king or a queen who has absolute power, and they also happen to be the head of the church. That's a problem, because then the church simply becomes a vehicle for them to accomplish what they want to accomplish politically. And I think that's problematic, and I think it's problematic in America in particular. I wish there was a way to to get that message across to people. But they have mixed, it's just like when, and people would have a huge problem with this, many people. But whenever I was a pastor of a church, one of the things I would ask them to do is, most American churches have an American flag in the sanctuary, in the place where they worship. And I would always ask them to take that out. Not that I'm anti-American at all. I'm a very patriotic person. But I wanted to make sure that when the word is being preached, that's not being done under the shadow of the flag of the United States of America. Because when you do that, it mixes the two to a place where I think is very unhealthy. And so a lot of churches didn't like that. But I said, that's a prerequisite. If I'm going to preach in this church, I won't preach under the shadow of the flag while I'm preaching. And so I don't know. It's a little bit of a different twist on things and a different idea on things.
Yeah.
I don't consider myself a liberal, but conservatives always do. Of course, liberals always think I'm a conservative. So when we were walking across America, a lot of people didn't want anything to do with the walk because they'd said, this is a Bush thing. It's when Bush was president. They'd say, this is a Bush thing. I know this isn't a Bush thing. This isn't a political thing at all.
That's right.
But people assume if you're doing something like walk across America, you must be a hippie, so you must be liberal. That's what the conservatives thought. And then they think if you're walking across America to reclaim it for the cause of Christ, then you must be a conservative. That's what the liberals thought. And so the people who were on both ends of that, and that's why I don't want that to be a part of the process for me.
Well, here in Canada, we have a conservative party and we have a liberal party, and we have other parties as well. So we actually come out and say liberal, conservative. Down in your country, it's Democrat, Republican. So
Right.
Republican is conservative and Democrat is supposedly liberal. I don't vote conservative. I never have. But I believe in a healthy conservative party, one that makes sense and puts forth proposals to make the country better, actual tangible proposals that we could debate on. It seems like in your country, your Republican Party is very unhealthy because they're not making any kind of proposals. They're going after issues that aren't really affecting people's lives. So it's becoming a very unhealthy conservative party, and I'd like to see it become healthy again, so that we can get back to the table and discuss important issues that really affect people's lives.
Yeah, I've always said for many, many years, I've said what we need in America is something called the Common Sense Party. Harkens back to the pamphlet that was written during the Revolutionary War, Common Sense. I think in some respects, both parties have lost their common sense. They are out to accomplish their own agenda without any regard for what's best for the country. And so I think a common sense party that just says, look, it doesn't matter if this falls on the conservative side of things or the liberal side of things. If this is what's best for people, this is how we can help the people in our nation, then that's what we ought to do rather than try to label it conservative or liberal. That's not a particularly popular view. And I think that's one of the dangers of a almost exclusive two-party system, is that people feel like they have to make a choice between those two parties. Third party, generally third and fourth and fifth party candidates aren't taken very seriously. Most of the time, they're not invited to debates. People don't get to really hear their ideas. They can't raise the money with the organizations that the two parties can. And so I think a lot of times the people who are speaking the most sense and who have the best direction for the country never get heard.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's a shame.
Yeah. I worked in network level television here in Canada for 15 years in the news department. And what they tended to go after was the most spectacular thing, the noisiest stuff. And what you and your wife did ought to be not necessarily your exact story, but the energy that you bring to the table here in terms of Christianity. We don't see that in mainstream media. We see the kooks, making crazy remarks, and then the people criticizing it. But in between there is you and Jane and people like
I
you.
hope so. I hope so. And you also see in the media lots of blame. which you know, I think is almost never healthy. It's not helpful. It's just like a married couple. You know, if they spend all their time arguing about who's to blame for this argument, who's to blame for this mistake, it's hard to get past that. And I think that's one of the issues. And of course, that sells newspapers, that gets viewers on television, listeners on the radio to do the blame thing. That's what talk radio has become about on both sides of the political spectrum. Is, you know, the liberals blame the conservatives blame the liberals, and it's just not constructive. But hopefully, we'll move in that direction.
Yeah. Well, let's go to you arriving at Washington, and on that particular day, what was the rally that you were attending? What was that all about?
Well, it started that morning in it was very neat. We had walked to the edge of Arlington Memorial Cemetery on June 30th, had a few days of rest. On the 4th of July, we jumped over the rock fence that surrounds Arlington Memorial and walked past the Iwo Jima statue. And as we were walking past it, the Marine band was there playing hymns. It was just kind of one of those, I don't know, just surreal almost. It was like, you know, God had arranged them to be there to welcome us to Washington. We knew that wasn't the case, but that's how it felt. We walked down to the bridge. When we got down to the bridge that crosses the river Potomac into Washington, there was a big sign, bridge closed. And someone had called in a bomb threat that morning. And this was still very close to, 9/11. And so that was taken very seriously. So for over an hour, the bridge was closed and we couldn't cross. We had all those friends there. But during that hour, a reporter from the Washington Times shows up and sees my wife and I dressed alike and this crowd of people around us and starts interviewing us. And they did about a 30-minute interview with us, took pictures of us walking across the bridge. And on the next morning, we were on the front of the second section of the Washington Times.
Wow.
And the whole story about the walk across America. So
great.
As soon as we crossed the bridge, we knelt and prayed with our friends and thanked God for the trip and for the safety and all that sort of thing. Then we went to the Supreme Court and we had a rally there and I gave a speech. And to be honest with you, the speech was very much the things I've said to you this morning. This is where we are as a country. This is where I feel like we need to go and be. This is what God has changed our hearts and minds about during this walk. And it was one of those moments that you remember forever and ever and ever. And then we climbed the steps of the Supreme Court as far as they will let you go. You can't go all the way up, but we went up several steps and we had our last prayer there on the Supreme Court steps, just thanking God for the trip and asking him to do a work in our country that would bring us closer to what he desires for us to be. So it's a day that will live in our memories forever. As I said, it was the capstone for the most amazing thing. We were together 24 hours a day for 6 months. Of course, we've been together most of our life with very few exceptions. We do everything together. But just that experience being so intense, when you do something like that, everything intensifies. I always use this illustration. When you're driving down the interstate or you're driving down a side road and you see one of those white crosses beside the road. I don't know if they do that in Canada, but here in America, we do that. Okay.
I think about that too.
You see one of those, and when you're going 60, 70 miles an hour, you see it for a split second. You don't think about it too much. You realize what it's there for, but you don't think about it too much. When you're walking, you see that white cross for half a mile before you get there. And every step you take, you get closer. When you get there, you can read the name on the cross. You see the little teddy bear that's been strapped to the cross. And then you think about it for a half a mile down the road. Every emotion, every sight, every smell, every feeling, every experience is magnified times 10 or 50 or 100 when you're walking. And so that's one of the reasons we really wanted this story to be told, because it's America under a magnifying glass. You see it with a clarity that you don't see it the way we normally live life. And for that, I will be eternally grateful.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so changed by the walk.
Wonderful. So when was this book published?
We published in May. It's been out almost 3 months. It's done very well. It was the #1 new release when it first came out, and it's been the #1 bestseller in our category, which is Christian Evangelism, a couple of times since then. It's not making us millions of dollars. Matter of fact, we figured up the other day, I think we're getting very close to breaking even. So
Yeah,
you
sure. Well,
don't get rich. But
that's
we didn't write it for that reason, for that
no.
purpose. We both still work, and so we didn't count on that to make a living. I have a woodworking shop. I make stuff out of wood, and I teach at the university. My wife teaches high school, and so we did it to get the story out, and the fact that we didn't lose a lot of money on it. We're grateful for that.
Do you have a website?
Yeah. It's very simple to remember. And So We Walked, which is the name of the book, and so we walked.org, or rickandjanemckinney.com. Either one will get you to the same website.
Okay. Well, I'll put that in the description below.
Okay.
Rick, we've been talking for quite a while here, and every bit of it has been very interesting. This has been just a very good interview, and I hope you had a good time.
I did. I really enjoyed it, John.
Me
Thank you
too.
so much.
Oh, you're welcome. So to you and Jane, I bid you farewell and wish you well in the future with your messaging, which you do very well. So it was nice to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for watching. If you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then please subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and don't forget to ring that bell for future notifications. And if you are an author, I would really like to speak with you. Until such time, keep on writing and be kind to one another.